Senator, welcome back to the program here. NASA and Artemis, obviously huge priorities of yours. You secured the $10 billion in long-term funding for the program, especially after its successful return from around the moon the other day. But President Trump, again, proposing significant cuts to NASA, billions of dollars, 23% of the budget. Congress told him no earlier this year. Where are you on this again? Would you support or oppose that?
We're going to continue to see a strong bipartisan coalition supporting NASA, supporting commercial space, supporting American leadership in space. I got to say, this past week, everyone across the country and all across the world watched and held their breath as we sent astronauts back to the moon, orbiting the moon. The four astronauts, just a couple of days ago, I spoke with them while they were still in space, and got a chance to speak with Reed and Victor and Christina and Jeremy, and they went further from the human from the Earth's surface than any human has in American history. And it was powerful, it was inspirational, and the Artemis program, we are going back to the moon. This was Artemis 2. Artemis 4, we will land astronauts on the surface of the moon. And I will say one thing that I'm particularly proud of is Artemis 4, we will land the first woman on the moon. You know, if you look at Greek mythology, Artemis was the twin sister of Apollo. And the Apollo program, we landed the first man on the moon. I got to say, as the father of daughters, I'm really proud that America is going to put the first woman on the moon. It will be an American astronaut. And listen, we are in a race with China. Yeah. China has stated their intention to go to the moon, to land an astronaut on the surface of the moon by 2030. And we are going to beat China back to the moon. And we're in the middle of what is essentially a land grab. If you look at the prime territory, the most critical territory is near the southern pole, where you have access to water, and you also have craters of sufficient height that you can get solar power and power a lunar base. It is American policy. We are going to create a lunar base, a base on the surface of the moon to engage in exploration, to engage in discovery. The funding is there. You are right that last year, the Office of Management and Budget suggested cutting much of the funding for the moon. And in the Working Families Tax Cut that we passed last year, I wrote the legislation providing $10 billion to fund what we just saw, Artemis going back to the moon, and to continue funding putting American astronauts back on the moon. I think that's critically important.
The president does want to prioritize Artemis, but can NASA afford to cut 40 or plus, other science missions?
Look, we're not going to see a major cut in NASA. That is not going to happen. Okay. I've been in the Senate 14 years, and from the day I was elected, space has been a major priority for me. I'm a lifelong Houstonian. Obviously, the Johnson Space Center is hugely important to Texas. And if you look at commercial space, we have SpaceX here, we have Blue Origin has major operations here. We have over 50,000 high-paying jobs come from commercial space, and that is a huge generator of jobs, of economic productivity. And I've spent 14 years in the Senate as the leading champion for space, both for NASA and for commercial space. Johnson Space Center is the beating heart of space exploration. America will lead the world in space exploration. And we just passed out of the Senate Commerce Committee, which I chair, legislation making clear that Johnson Space Center will continue to be the command center for the lunar base. We are going to beat China. We are going back to the moon, and then ultimately we're going to Mars. And American leadership is powerful. And I got to say, Jason, every little girl, every little boy who looked up last week and realized we had American astronauts in space, every child who put on the internet and saw those astronauts floating, saw the floating bobblehead that they would have in so many of those interviews. We're inspiring the next generation with American leadership. I think that's really powerful.
Are you concerned at all well, let me ask you this. How do you keep NASA at the cutting edge when you have so many other private space companies, SpaceX, Blue Origin, and the others who are chomping at the bit and might be able to do this a heck of a lot cheaper than the government?
Yeah, the beauty of it is that both are integral. We no longer have a system that thinks it's only the federal government that can lead on space. And I'm a huge champion of the commercial space industry because the investment that it's going to take is massive. It's much larger than the taxpayers are willing to foot the bill. And so I've predicted for more than a decade that the first trillionaire will be made in space. There are enormous economic opportunities. We're going to the moon, number one, the opportunities for rare earth minerals and mining. And by the way, not even rare earth, like rare moon, we may discover new minerals, new elements on the lunar surface. We don't know that yet. But I think there are enormous economic opportunities. It is also critical for defense and national security. More and more of our national security is space-based between satellites and GPS and targeting and surveillance. That's one of the big reasons that China wants to get to the moon, is to seize literally the high ground. In terms of defending America, we can't let China do that. And so I could not be more encouraged, because the beauty of commercial space is that they're a force multiplier. They are investing vastly more money than NASA spends, and that lets us get to the moon. It lets us develop the technology we need, and ultimately it'll take us to Mars.
Let me ask you one other transportation question today. There's news out today that United Airlines CEO is proposing potentially a merger with Fort Worth-based American Airlines. It would create obviously a behemoth airline. A lot of questions around that on what it might mean to consumer choices. What do you think about that idea?
Look, it's not a question I have examined. Obviously, anytime you have a merger, particularly of large players, you've got antitrust scrutiny that would occur. And so we'd have to assess it on the merits. My focus, I am, as chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee, one of the critical areas of jurisdiction we have is aviation. And I'm a big fan of the aviation sector because it's a huge job creator for Texas. It is not just the jobs in aviation, but aviation is critical for so many other industries, for getting to your customers, traveling around. And Texas is a global leader in aviation. We'd have to assess any proposed merger for what the impact will be on consumers, and in particular, what the impact will be on consumer prices, that we want prices low. We want air travel to be affordable. And so that would be assessed on the merits.
Could there be an airline that's too large?
Look, we have the existing antitrust laws to prevent monopolization. And so the scrutiny for any time you have a merger is looking at the relative market share of the players and whether combining that market share would give so much market power that you would see prices go up, that it would harm consumers. That's the antitrust law inquiry. Right. And so you would see the Department of Justice assess that, and they would look to economics, they would look to data to analyze that. And I think Congress would be very interested in that very same question.
Just out of curiosity, what was your reaction when you saw the headline today?
Look, we will assess it on the merits. I have to admit, it hit me as a bit of a surprise. So we'll see. But the objective needs to be protecting consumers and ensuring that air travel is affordable and also ensuring that it's safe.
A couple other quick questions here. You've said the U.S. is winning the war with Iran. The president's strikes were decisive, I think, is some of the quotes that you said. But what is the end game you'd actually like to see here? Is it regime change, deterrence, unilateral surrender here? What would you like to see happen?
Well, this is a topic that I've discussed at great length, in particular on my podcast, Verdict with Ted Cruz. Actually, yesterday's podcast got into great detail, but I will say there are a series of objectives. First of all, there was the military objectives. And the military objectives that President Trump laid out at the front end were taking out Iran's air defenses. We've succeeded in that. Taking out their ballistic missiles. We've succeeded in that. Taking out their ability to manufacture new ballistic missiles. We've succeeded in that. Taking out their drones and their drone manufacturing capability, we've succeeded in that. Taking out their Air Force and taking out their Navy, we've succeeded in that as well. In terms of military objectives, it is an incredible success. It took Iran 40 years to build up the military they had. It took us 39 days to almost totally obliterate it. We also succeeded in taking out the Ayatollah and virtually all of the senior military leadership. That is enormously consequential. Now, the next two stages are both very significant. President Trump has drawn a red line and said under no circumstances will Iran be allowed to acquire nuclear weapons. So he's insisted on, number one, no enrichment, and number two, that Iran must hand over the enriched uranium that it has. In the negotiations in Pakistan, Iran refused on both of those. They are adamant that they want to continue developing nuclear weapons. I think President Trump is exactly right to say no. And listen, the reason is I believe a nuclear Iran would pose a clear and present danger to the United States, that when the Ayatollah chants death to America, I believe him. I don't think that's empty rhetoric. And the reason President Trump is acting is to keep Americans safe, to prevent the Ayatollah from having nuclear weapons that could kill hundreds of thousands or even millions of Americans. And so that red line, President Trump is exactly right to say under no circumstances will we let Iran get nuclear weapons. Now, secondly, you ask about regime change. I think the objective here should be the collapse of this regime. This regime for 47 years has been waging war on America. You look at literally when the Islamic Revolution began in 1979, one of the very first things they did was seize the American embassy and keep Americans hostage for 444 days. Over the last 47 years, Iran has been the #1 funder of terrorism worldwide. They provide more than 90% of the funds to Hamas, to Hezbollah, to the Houthis. The Iranian regime has killed nearly 1,000 Americans, and President Trump acted decisively here to keep Americans safe, to stop the Iranians from continuing to murder Americans year after year after year. That's the job of the commander-in-chief, keeping Americans safe. And I think America would be much, much safer if this regime collapses. Now, who the next government is in Iran, that's not our problem. I'm not interested in nation building. I'm not interested in turning Iran into a democratic utopia. But I would like to see them have a government that is not led by Islamists who hate America, who are chanting death to America, who are funding people murdering Americans. As long as they're not killing Americans, they can run their own country and that's their own business. But if they're killing Americans, that's our business. And that's why President Trump has acted.
Let me ask you one last question here, Senator. Iran rejected the peace deal. We're 45 days in now to this war, starting back in February. Are you concerned at all that this could drag out and become one of these never-ending wars that voters said they don't want to see again?
No, I don't think there's any possibility of that. And look, to understand, we have had a military conflict here, but Iran is not Iraq. They're very different, and people are understandably weary of Iraq. We are not going to see in Iran hundreds of thousands of troops on the ground. We are not going to see a sustained occupation. The mission goal in Iran is very different than Iraq. I believe the Iraq war was a mistake. And one of the biggest mistakes we made in the Iraq war was engaging in nation building, trying to turn Iraq essentially into Switzerland. And that was a failed endeavor. And I don't think that's the job of our military, to try to recreate or rebuild foreign nations. What is the job of our military is to defeat our enemies. And so I think President Trump has been very focused on protecting America. This is an America first foreign policy. The reason Iran has been facing these military attacks is because they have been murdering Americans, and President Trump said no more. We're not going to see a sustained occupation because we're not engaged in the objective of nation building. We're engaged in the objective of keeping America safe.
Senator, thank you for the time. We appreciate it as always.
Thank you, Jason.